Good morning, everyone. Very nice to see you all again. I feel that I was lucky to be part of this conversation. I guess it wasn't quite a year ago, it was 9 months ago, when we last discussed progress in preparing 1 billion people for tomorrow's economy. So I'm very excited to be here again to see how much progress has been made in the last few months. But this is, as you know, it's not just an enormous priority for the world, it's an enormous priority for the World Economic Forum, which has a huge initiative on reskilling. And it is rightly so, I think. This is one of the, if not the challenges of our time. I mean, how we prepare people to have the skills for tomorrow's economy is not just going to impact the pace of economic growth. It's frankly also going to impact political stability. It's going to impact government finances. It's going to impact everybody's well-being. If we don't have people with the skills for tomorrow's economy, then we have a very, very big problem. And so I think we have to be honest about how much progress we've made, and we have to be honest about how the task is changing. You know, the impact of the pandemic on the way we work was dramatic, and the impact on technology, on the kinds of skills that are going to be disrupted, is also changing rapidly. I don't know, how many of you have used ChatGPT? How many of you think it is going to fundamentally change the work world that you are in? Yeah, everyone's hands goes up. That's just in the past few months. So I think it's a very powerful testament to why this is a really, really important subject. Are we transforming our education system, our skills, fast enough to, take advantage of and to benefit from and to profit from this new technology rather than simply be displaced by it? So to discuss this extraordinarily important subject, for very different views, for extraordinary individuals from different parts of the world and different industries. So I'm going to start, I guess, on my far right. There we go. You're on the screen, Jonas. Jonas Priesing, Chairman, Chief Executive Officer of the Manpower Group. He is a key member of the WEF's initiative on this. So, Jonas, very nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Next to me here, we have Minister Belloul, Minister of Education of the UAE, one of the a very young workforce and a country that is embracing technology very rapidly. So I'm very keen to hear what you are up to. Here, Belén Garrijo, Chairman of the Executive Board and Chief Executive Officer of Merck, another champion of this subject at the WEF. Very nice to see you, Belén. And last but absolutely not least, CVK to everybody, but CVJ Kumar, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of HCL. So I hope we'll hear from you, not just how technology is going to impact this, but how technology is going to help us. Sure. So very nice to see all four of you. Let's start, Jonas, let's start with you. And why don't you give us a sense of the progress, actually, first of all, that this initiative has made, because you've been so involved with it, but a sort of status report of where we've got to.
Yes, no, I think it's a discussion we started here in January of 2020, and it was on the back of an OECD report that was published right before our event in 2020, which looked at the impact of technology on the global workforce and predicted that 1 billion people would need to significantly reskill to be able to take advantage of the technological transformation that was occurring at the time and has accelerated since then. So that was the start of the Reskilling Revolution initiative, shepherded by the WEF with lots of different participants, public sector, private sector, civil society, all part of this discussion. What would need to be done to address this issue and make sure that people have the opportunity to participate in the technological transformation? And, I think the pandemic, and you talked about the pandemic as a big watershed moment, is, from our perspective, a really look into the future of work. So what happens when demographic trends start to impact economic growth and access to workforce? In this case, impacted by a healthcare crisis, but it just restricted the access of people. And as you will all have seen earlier this morning, China reported for the first time in 50 years that their population has now stopped growing and is starting to decline. We all know 8 billion on the planet a couple of months ago was the number, heading towards 10. But that's it. Then there is no further population growth coming. So demographic trends were very visible. The impact of technology, when we had to change very, very quickly. We pivoted on how we got work done, how the workforce and employees were engaging, how employers were reacting. So really looking at rapid transformative evolution of technology and how that changed the interaction. You looked at individuals who, of course, had to pivot and adjust to a new environment and work in different ways, but also discovered the opportunity to work in different ways that suited them better. So the long-awaited possibility to better balance work and life, and what that means for their preferences as they look ahead into their career choices. And last but not least, companies having to pivot very quickly, working in different ways, leveraging technology in ways that they had not anticipated. So very quickly, during the pandemic, we got to look into what happens when those structural trends really come to impact at scale. And what we can observe is we're able to change much faster than we thought. We are able to pivot as individuals. We're able to pivot as organizations. Society is able to adjust. Many good things can happen, but also it provides stark evidence of the fact that those that have the skills can fully participate. We sometimes forget in our excitement over remote working that this is the minority of the workforce, by and large, of the global workforce, and in most countries that are able to participate in remote working, because during the pandemic we also saw the extraordinary effort and impact the frontline workers had. So the conclusion is the progress we are making is quite significant, but not sufficient. And I had the opportunity to participate earlier in a session of the Reskilling Revolution champions, looking back and seeing where the progress lies. And I'm pleased to report to this audience that from a public sector perspective, whether it's the Secretary of Labor for the US, Commissioner Schmidt for the EU, Minister Indira from India, the public sector realizes this is going to be a big challenge. So they are aware of the challenge that is coming their way on a rapidly changing environment where new skills are going to be needed faster than any time before, which is a good evolution. I am also pleased to report that from a private sector perspective, 80% of employers today are investing heavily in reskilling and upskilling their own workforce. And whenever possible, also at a broader scale, helping society and their communities upskill the workforce at large.
So that's really interesting. So you think the pandemic accelerated the public sector's appreciation of the challenge?
I think the public sector realized that look at how quickly we have to adjust. Look at how quickly whatever we thought was going to happen in terms of interaction between employers and employees all gets upended in 3 weeks. And we have to find new ways of verifying identities, checking references, things like that. And I think whilst we're far from gaining traction at any level of speed of market, I think it's very encouraging to see that the public sector across the world, very developed markets, very mature labor markets, very fast growing, the biggest labor market in the world, India, are making great strides to embrace the digital transformation as it relates to the need for new skills of the workforce.
So I'm going to ask you, Minister, in a second, as a representative of the public sector here, whether you agree with that. But first, Belen, I wanted to come to you because your company was so closely and instrumentally and importantly involved during the pandemic. Do you agree with that characterization of how the pandemic changed the appreciation for the need for skills adjustment? And more specifically, what kind of change did you see?
Right. No, thank you so much. First of all, good morning, everyone. Of course, I agree that the pandemic disrupted very significantly our economies and our societies, and for the private sector, it was a great opportunity to accelerate some of the strategic people plans that we already had in place, right? You mentioned everything started in January 2020. That was the last wave before the pandemic.
Yes.
And even when we were smelling that the whole thing was going to happen and that the world was going to be in turmoil, the pandemic, let's face it, caught us off guard, right? And there is an early phase in which we have to engage our workforce in a completely different way to be able to accelerate the digital transformation of the company, to make sure that people could follow and that we could ensure business continuity, mainly on the supply chain and production, through getting people, effective operating in a different way.
Give us a sense of what you did at Merck. How did you accelerate your reskilling?
Well, I mean, we were already, we have been a company using hybrid work and remote work for many, many years. In 2013, we already changed the policy and allowed our people mainly to make sure that we could integrate certain vulnerable populations like female and other populations into the workforce and help them develop and grow. We already had tons of flexibility. But of course, nobody felt the need to use those technologies that were at hand to them until we have to stop working in the office from one day to the other.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the true for every company, that even if you had the capacity, you weren't using it. But did you change did your view of the skills your workforce needed change? Did it impact the kind of the reskilling that we're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the kind of leaders that we needed to have leading the company was absolutely different. So we did a lot of leadership development during those days. The connectivity, the digital connectivity was something new to the whole organization. Half of our workforce, mainly people in the factories and in the labs, didn't have a computer at home, right? So we have to very quickly equip those people to catch up in the hybrid work. Of course, we started to worry about cybersecurity, right? And most importantly, we automated, or we aim to automate many of our processes, mainly on manufacturing, to be able to be more effective and efficient, right? So it was a cultural transformation first, right? And we did a lot on culture, right? To make sure that we put people at the center, and most importantly, that while dealing with the acute phase, we prepare for the future through
the next phase,
reshaping our strategic workforce planning approach.
So I'm going to turn now to you, Minister. A very young workforce. You must be thinking about what kinds of jobs are you going to need to prepare people for. How has that thinking developed in the last couple of years? How do you go about thinking, what are the skills that my citizens need, and how am I going to prepare them for it?
So I think that's the billion-dollar question, right? So when you develop your programs at K-12 and higher education, historically we used to look at the next 5 years of precise demand by industry, right? So there's a gap between educational outcomes and what the labor market requires today. That has always existed. But now we're thinking even beyond that. What we have seen in terms of research was, if you go back a generation ago, the average person changed jobs about 4 times. Now it's 7. It's predicted to be 12 times. So 12 jobs in a lifetime. So that in mind, and the changing evolution of the jobs, you'd have to think about, I hate to use the word soft skills because they're not soft at all. We're focusing a lot on adaptability. How can I graduate students who have interdisciplinary majors and also are able to adapt? So as an example, we chose one of our federal institutions, Zayed University, which accounts for about 15% of our students. And now we're phasing out by 2026 all traditional degrees. They'll all be interdisciplinary. So we're talking about social entrepreneurship. We're talking about business innovation. So we're trying as much as we can to intertwine different fields of study to graduate students that are interdisciplinary, but also focus on the soft skills that we will believe will be much more useful in the future. Because at the end of the day, you can retrain someone technically, but if they don't acquire the soft skills during the educational system, it's difficult to train someone later on.
So that's a really interesting shift, because I imagine what you told me, but if 5 years ago we would have been saying, do they have STEM skills? Do we have people with the kinds of STEM skills we need? Now it's interdisciplinary and soft skills.
Yes.
I mean, we have here our representative from the tech industry. Do you recognize this, and do you think that the kind of skills people are going to need are less technical and more soft, given what's happening?
Yeah, my view is, I think there has been an evolution on both dimensions. I think the technology skills continue to become more and more complex. The need to reskill yourself with new technologies continues to be very, very high. But the soft skills, or what you may not call it as soft skills, but really the softer skills also is becoming very, very important. And I think one very important thing which the pandemic did, apart from different types of skills that were needed, I think it gave people a lot of time, at least in the technical industry, it gave people a lot of time, which they could productively utilize for reskilling, right? A lot of companies, big tech companies, we've been driving this reskilling. I mean, while you can have an organizational strategy, but it's also personal goals of individuals wanting to learn new things and upskill themselves with new technology. We saw a huge uptick in people taking on a lot of online programs and reskilling themselves. I think that just one thing, more time being available, has really accelerated the reskilling for the tech industry, at least. I'm not so sure about other industries.
So I'm going to ask you to spontaneous reskilling by your employees, and also I'd love to ask both of you about this shift towards soft skills. Are you seeing this too, that you are more focusing on soft skills, or is it still technical skilling that you're looking for?
I mean, I mentioned leadership development as a first priority for us during the pandemic, and this would qualify as soft, right? And you know, we are building what we call human-centric organization, or radically human organizations, as I like to call it, and many people have called it like this, or several other people have called it like this, and this is people at the center, right? And you know, I really want to offer a point that is not fully aligned with what you said. I think during the pandemic, our people was absolutely overwhelmed, you know, trying to catch up and perform. Sure. In a completely different world, with a tremendous sense of urgency, have no time for upskilling. So it was you know, this notion of getting, helping people navigate through the crisis, right, while preparing for the future, was the biggest challenge that I personally faced.
I think it's probably, in the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of time went into how can you respond, how can you help people. And I'm sure healthcare industry had very, very different challenges ahead of them. But at some point when maybe pandemic has been a very long event, it's been 2 years plus. So I think after some time, people didn't have to commute. They could do a lot of work in the tech industry. They could do almost everything virtually. And that did give them time. I mean, I think it's going to be different for different industries.
Can I bring in Jonas? Because you have a broad multi-industry perspective on this. What's your sense?
Well, what we're seeing, and what we're also getting from Manpower Group surveys and others interviewing both, looking for employees as well as employers, is the reason I think we're moving more towards soft skills is that many organizations are taking it upon themselves to develop the skills of their workforce that they need and provide the tools so they can do it, on the one hand. On the other hand, employees are clearly aware of the need to improve their skill sets and are availing themselves to those opportunities that employers provide to a much greater degree today, to your point, TVK, with great difficulty sometimes, because you're really walking straight into this work-life balance, but reversing it because suddenly you need to juggle many different things. But many employers we talk to today are really saying, look, we will provide the skill sets needed based on a foundation of education. We're not worried about the hard skills, the technical skills. We can do this. We understand the structural trend changes. So scarcity of talent as opposed to skill shortages are two different things. Access to enough people in a labor market versus people that don't have the requisite skills, and there's a mismatch. We need people who have the soft skills to be able to engage, collaborate, because I think this notion of AI also has to be taken in the context of HI, so human intelligence. And from all of the evidence, despite everything else you read, it's enabling humans to become more productive. It's not replacing, but it requires a different skill set.
Let's turn to that now, and then we're going to come back again to soft skills, because this is really interesting. But let's just get, that's a really excellent overview of what's happened thanks to the pandemic. Let's now look forward a little bit, and I want to start with you, because perhaps you can tell us just how much difference the generative AI models, the new innovations in tech, are going to make to the nature of the skills that is required. And if I just this is a journalistic, I will simplify and exaggerate, but if, for the last decade, the view has been that essentially technology was going to displace rote work, and then it was going to displace up the skill ladder, but it was basically the kind of easily automatable tasks.
Yeah.
Is that fundamentally different now you've got foundational AI models? What kind of skills are going to be affected?
So AI has been prevalent for a couple of decades or even more, right? And all of us have experienced AI in some form or other, right? When you're doing online shopping, you have recommendations. It's either through machine learning or more analytical work, or when you're trying to go to a place, it tells you the fastest way to get there. So we've all got used to some level of assisted AI, which is helping us do our day-to-day things better. Generative AI, I think, it feels like it's really taking AI to a completely new levels in terms of content creation, in terms of how it can impact customer service, which is a very big industry. If you take a slightly bigger picture, right, of the 8 billion people in the world, 3.2 billion are really are working. They're in the labor pool. Of the 3.2, 1.6 billion people are employed in agriculture and industries, and 1.6 is employed in services. Of the 1.6, about 20% are employed in the tech services. Now, tech services, while it has a big influence on what technologies are getting created, what automation is coming, but it has a bigger impact on the rest of the services, which is 80% of the services. So I think ChatGPT and generative AI, I think it's going to create an ecosystem around itself, because ChatGPT is generative AI technology, but there needs to be a lot of ecosystem that needs to be created around it, which will drive a new level of innovation. And I do think it can significantly disrupt some of the traditional industries, like journalists will have a lot more time because they can get a lot of content created, so you might create more trouble for everybody.
Yeah, next year, this is going to be moderated by ChatGPT next year. I actually did, seriously, I thought of I ran out of time, but I was going to put into ChatGPT, all of your names and who you were, and then ask it what questions I should ask you, but I'm afraid I ran out of time to do that. But it will make a difference. Minister, you must be thinking about this. I mean, everybody is thinking about this. So how do you think about the impact of generative AI models for what this means for the education that you need to provide for your citizens?
Look, I think if anything, ChatGPT and other AIs are keeping academics up at night. I get questions on how can we assess our students, right? But from my perspective, look, at the end of the day, if you look at education traditionally, we always had some kind of technology that assisted us in let's say, analytics that we used to do manually. So if we go to the calculator, in the beginning, people were saying, why would you allow your kids to use a calculator? Because it's almost like cheating, right? And then there was scientific calculators, and now it moved up the scale. So from my perspective, I think ChatGPT is an interesting way for students to integrate with AI and to be able to utilize, because at the end of the day, they will deal with it on a daily basis once they graduate. But the smart thing is when it comes to assessment, right? So how do I assess these students? Even they interact with AI, how can I make sure that they understand the topic and not rely overly on some tool to do it for them? There are many ways to do it, but I'm a big embracer of that. I think you need to integrate that. You need to allow students to use it, similar sense to what we have done ages ago with many different technologies. I think it's just that as academics, we feel threatened when our basic way of assessment, such as assignments, gets, disrupted. Exactly.
And how are you thinking about changing the nature of assessment? You can't set essays because ChatGPT will write them. What will be the way that you will assess the actual knowledge of students?
Well, I used to be an assistant professor. If I was still in university, I would actually encourage them to use it, but then they'd have to explain it, because typing something to an AI is different, but then to be able to ask it the right way, because by the way you formulate the question affects the quality of the answer tremendously. So you could simply ask them to explain it. You can probe them, just like a PhD thesis, right? So there are many ways to do it. Some go to the other extreme where they say, we will just ban assignments. It'll all be in class. But I think that just defies the purpose. You need to encourage them to use AI and then test their knowledge of the content.
So include it almost in the assessment process.
Yes,
That's really interesting. I want for both of you, how big a part of your day-to-day thinking is the impact of generative AI models? How do you see it changing Mamha's work?
Well, I think we're very early in the process right now.
We're very excited.
Like,
I mean,
we're all
the
very
ratio-
excited, and we will extrapolate this excitement into many, many different things that will happen and in massive ways change the labor markets. And I would then take us just quickly back to a similar discussion 7 or 8 years ago here at the World Economic Forum. The main theme of that forum was hundreds of millions of people are going to be impacted by AI and automation. And we will have way more people than we will have jobs, and we don't know what to do with these people. And we should all implement government policies related to basic income and pay people for not working. And fast forward 7 years, the impact of technology has certainly been very swift and hard, and completely opposite. We are faced with a significant skills shortage. And I think what we believe is that this is a watershed moment. It will change the way we get work done. If history is a predictor, it's mostly going to be about how individuals interact with the technology, so embracing it as opposed to, no tests can be done, remotely. But I think we can with certainty say that it will impact the skill sets that are needed of the future workforce. And you asked earlier, in this environment, what is going to be a predictor of success? And if we think about, there was a time when IQ was used as an assessment of people's, assessment of likelihood to be successful in their careers, I think largely debunked. It is a contributor, but not a total contributor to what predicted performance is going to be like. LQ, learnability quotient, or the need to instill a sense of continuous learning, we won't know, we can't predict today what our discussion is going to be 7 years out. The future of work is going to be determined by the workers of the future. But what we can do is to ensure that we instill a notion, a necessity in organizations to keep and want to learn from an individual perspective. Because I think policymakers will start to shift sooner or later. Organizations are already shifting and are taking this as, there's a constrained labor market, I need to attract talent, come to me and I will give you great, great skills. Individuals, that is going to be a necessity for many of them. And I think, increasingly individuals are finding that this is what I need to do to stay competitive and have a great career and be able to provide for my family.
LQ, I've learned a new acronym. We'll come on to LQ when we go back to talking about soft skills. But just, Belen, I'd like your perspective on the impact that you think generative AI models will have. Are you thinking about where you can use them, which divisions are going to be most effective?
No, of course, but I mean, I would agree with Jason that we take technology as an enabler of human people, of human intelligence. So we use technology to drive many of our upskilling and training programs.
So you're not going to wipe out your marketing department yet?
Well, let me go there. Just give me a second. And we use technology to really make better decisions based on the data that we get to identify the needs, to identify the gap, et cetera, or to match our talent with the need internally. We look at holistically, and we have an AI-based model to help us match capabilities with needs within a 60,000 people organization, right? So from that perspective, technology is important, but I am absolutely aligned that, the impact of automation and artificial intelligence has not been less jobs, but different jobs, and there, going back to your point, obviously what we have seen in the last 5 to even, 5 years and forward is that whenever we have marketeers, we need less marketeers and more data scientists, and it's not only, we cannot take upskilling as an standalone approach. We need to understand what is happening moving forward, and this is why, reshaping our strategic thinking on people and capabilities is absolutely key, because of the scarcity of certain skills that we need to continue to perform our business in a very effective and efficient way.
And so many of those are soft skills and LQ, as you put it, which I've now learned. And I want to move on to that now, how we foster that. But just just one quick whip round. In 2020, the OECD said 1 billion jobs were liable to be radically transformed by technology. Would you say now the number was higher? And if so, by how much, or lower? You don't need to give a number, but just how, I want to know the impact you think this, technological changes since 2020 have had on that number. Is it now 1.5 billion, 2 billion? Is it less than that?
No, I think it's not that 1 billion jobs are eliminated. I think it's 1 billion roles will need reskilling, right?
But is that a bigger number now that we have generative AI
I think it's going to be different for different industries. If you see technology industry, 1 billion is about a third of the workforce, right? But in the technology industry, it could be a little higher, maybe more than half of the workforce needed to get reskilled. One advantage that the tech industry has is it has a huge influx of young talent. So when they come in, they get trained on new technologies. Like we have a program called TechBees where we onboard students who finish 12th standard, and globally we call it as a global apprenticeship program. We bring young people and really train them on new technologies, and that's been an extremely valuable effort because they're able to quickly learn new skills and really be productive in about 6 to 9 months.
That's about. So because I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, let's have one last round of discussion on where you think the priorities are, and particularly this soft skill area. I'm really interested in this. So if soft skills are more important, and I want to start with you, Minister, how do you go about preparing people for those soft skills? I mean, you said interdisciplinary education. That's clearly one important one. But beyond that, how radical does the transformation of our education system and indeed ongoing employer skilling need to be to really promote soft skills?
Let me just build up on a comment that Jonas made about employers. If I go back 5, 10 years ago, they would be complaining saying your engineers or your computer science they don't have the exact skills that we need for the job on the spot. Exactly.
Yeah, right.
But now they said, don't worry about that. We can fine-tune them, quote unquote, but they want them to have the interpersonal skills. So how do we do that? I think one of the biggest challenges we have is the LQ or CQ. I'm going to give another one, capacity quotient, or learning. It's the same thing.
Are we going to have a whole alphabet of cues?
No,
This is part of this session.
Exactly. So it's IQ, EQ, and the third one is about learning and capacity to learn, right? So that, I think, is the single most or biggest priority that we have, is to educate students that we are giving you the foundation. However, when you graduate, that's when your learning journey starts. This is just a basis for you to build upon. So it's very difficult for someone who graduates to expect to continuously be learning and in some cases even drastically change their field. So again, the foundation needs to be more interdisciplinary. The learning side needs to be more about self-learning and self-paced learning, and hence the interaction with the likes of ChatGPT. But at the end of the day, the LQ or CQ needs to be central, where students know and have access to continuous learning. That's a very big debate. Who handles that? Is it the employer? Is it the university? Or is it the government? That's yet to be resolved. That means different things to different governments.
And what do you think? Because it does seem, when I hear you describing this, it seems completely crazy that we, focus education overwhelmingly on the beginning of someone's life and career, and then the state steps out. I mean, do you think the government has an ongoing role in topping up CQ, if you will?
It depends. So, for example, in Singapore, government is very much hands-on. In the US, it's mostly self-driven by the individual. For us now, we're considering putting a bit of weight on university to say, as a university, as an institution, to be able to operate in the UAE, you would have to have a commitment to have that link with your graduates and offer whatever they ask for free of charge. So that's one angle of linking to. But the question is, would that be relevant to the workforce? So again, we're still testing. There's no right or wrong answer. But I'm leaning more towards keeping these universities' connection much longer with the alumni.
And are your higher education institutions, are your universities, are their faculties capable of doing this change? I mean, do you need to disrupt them as well?
Absolutely. They wouldn't be able to do it on their own. So in order to do that, they'd have to be closely linked with the private sector in the specific fields. If it's done in isolation, that content will be completely irrelevant to someone who's been in the job for 5 years. So this continuous education that we're trying to solve for is very much an integration of the private sector, the employers, and the universities. Because you can't give theoretical content to someone who's on their job 17
So
years
it's a
later.
much closer link with employers.
Yes.
Jonas, how do you see this, and how do you promote we have CQ here, you're LQ. How do you push for more LQ?
Well, if I may go back, you asked about, does government have a role past, the formal education? And just as the minister says, if you look at Singapore, you look at France, and take France as an example, every individual in France, and able to work, gets a personal training portfolio. So every year they can save 500 euros up to 5,000, which they are able to spend on the training they think they need to develop their skill sets. 5 million people have taken advantage of this opportunity. So you can clearly see that governments are realizing it's not over. It will be a continuous evolution over time. And I find that very encouraging. Singapore's done the same, and other governments are experimenting exactly with the same kind of approach to encourage lifelong learning.
That encourages the lifelong bit. How do you encourage the soft skills bit? How do you do that?
Well, I think what we've learned during the pandemic is, and Belan talked about the need for leadership change. Middle management on premise works with task that needs to be completed, and you supervise the completion of the task. If you are in a remote working environment, the interaction is much more about an expected outcome. Never mind how you get there, but this is the result that needs to be produced. And it's a very big shift on how you engage with your employees. And I think a lot of organizations are very focused on developing the soft skills in a different way than we used to in the past, so that we're able to generate this kind of leadership behavior. And I think that's very much a shift that the minister described as well over time. 5 years ago, it was all about we don't have the skills, and what happens? It takes 12 years to get them, and they're all wrong when they arrive. Today, organizations are saying, okay, yeah, but things are moving so fast, so you'll never get it right. Never mind. But please engage in group work, project work, in other ways of leveraging different assets so that you can acquire learning in a different way, not rote learning, because that's not going to be useful for us.
So is this how you see it too? So the expectation or the hope is individuals come from higher education with the capability to acquire more soft skills, and then they come to you and you encourage that. I'm just trying to see where is the responsibility for this?
Unfortunately, we work with very prestigious universities and really to source young talent, and the soft skills piece is something that we develop inside. I don't think we are at the level in which universities are creating good leaders, right? I think the level of awareness, both at the public sector level, but also the students themselves, right, requires additional development so that people understand that no matter what they do, if their aspiration and their ambition is to have a high impact job with people, right, and making an impact, they need to be good leaders, effective leaders. And so we are placing tremendous importance on that. I mentioned culture. Culture is nothing without, being cascaded into concrete leadership behaviors, right? So we have put a lot of emphasis in building a caring organization. We go back to the people-centric organization in which leaders understand what the expectations are in order to be able to be at the level that is required.
So it has to be done by the company.
We do that a lot.
CVK, just very briefly before I open to questions, what can technology do to encourage soft skills?
See, I think when people come out of the education system, soft skills are very raw. And the learnability quotient that you talked about is very much relevant for soft skills and hard technical skills. And today, in most work environments, you need people to work in groups. So collaboration is becoming such an important thing. People work in a group of pod or a squad to build programs and things like that. So I think one of the most fundamental soft skills is how will you work together with a set of people. That becomes so important. And I think they learn as they get deployed on programs, and I think the learnability quotient is such an important thing to kind of come up to speed and to really be a very effective contributor.
Well, this is proving quite a good group here. We're not doing too badly. Let's open this up to questions. Yes, lady in the front here, in the black sweater.
The Nowhere Office Project and the work shift column for Bloomberg. I wonder what the panel thinks about executive education and in particular the MBA. Seems to me that we're overlooking the fact that institutionally this isn't possibly as fit for purpose as it once was. Certainly current MBA curriculums in their majority sort of end of the gig economy. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about executive education, and specifically, are we going to see the next generation of leaders for whom the MBA is their golden ticket?
Minister, this looks like one for you.
Sure, I'll take
Time
that.
to get rid of the MBA.
Well, look, I think if you were to ask people in the room who have done MBAs, they would tell you that one of the singlest, most valuable things out of the MBA was the network that they've developed and the ability to work with people. And some of them continue leveraging that network decades later. So I think that experience, to your point about collaboration, at that time when the education system was so rigid, the collaborative environment used to work at the MBA. And you've always required to have experience to make that discussion meaningful. Now, is it obsolete? I don't think so. So we still see a lot of demand because we send students also abroad. But we, as the Ministry of Education, don't send students on scholarships paid by us to do MBAs.
Oh, really?
Yes, we stopped that.
So
So
the
they're
UAE
more
has
than
stopped
happy
sending them
to do that. But us, as Ministry of Education, we stopped that temporarily. We're focusing more on other topics. We believe that's more of a personal development as opposed to something that we would fund.
Interesting.
I
Very
am-
brief.
So
I'm
another
sorry.
perspective, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I just wanted to interject a bit of a provocative thought, because I am, perhaps because of my own experience, I am a firm believer of learning and developing on the job,
Yep.
not in the classroom, right? So from that perspective, you know, each and every program that may enhance or inspire people to learn is fine, but to be honest, I don't believe on that, you know?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I
Very
was-
briefly, because I want to get one more
I was
question.
going to say the same thing. I think the biggest part of any executive education is the case studies, right? You learn, you're given a different set of situations and you come up with solutions. Maybe as it evolves, those case studies will have to be very different, because today many of those case studies could be done with a lot of other ways of doing it. So maybe they have to evolve. And there is really no substitute to learning on the job, because you get a lot more relevant experience there.
If it's very quick, your hand has been up a lot. Very brief question, last question. Go.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Mandeep Rai of the Values Compass with the BBC. It seems that you're all investing in people. You talk about learning on the job, you talk about LQ, CQ, etc. How much emphasis can we put on actually hiring people that have values? Do you put any emphasis on that? Does that ever come up? Thank you.
200%.
Yeah.
I suspect you're going to get total agreement here. Anybody not care about values?
Or does it come up when you're hiring? Like, do you actually...
I hire for attitude, not only for experience.
I couldn't agree more.
Attitude
Yeah.
is the most important thing we look for.
And your HR are aware of it,
Yes,
and that's what
absolutely.
within 5 minutes.
You know, is that attracting talent is not an HR topic. Developing people is not an HR topic. This is a fundamental leadership priority, you know?
100%.
And that is a super critical question. I mean, I was a bit radical saying we hire for attitude and not for experience, but, you know, that's the vision, right? It's always having a higher impact if you think of attitude and values, not only on experience. That is a big fundamental shift on the way we approach hiring people today.
But I think, you know, an important topic here is, though, with the increased transparency and the visibility of what companies are doing, it's not so much we clearly pay attention to the values, but I think job seekers who are interested in an organization increasingly want to know what are the values of the organization that I'm about to lend my talents and my skills to. So I think not only is it important as you manage the business, but it's really important to the people that are looking at an organization as a potential future employer. They want to know what is the purpose of this organization and what values do they espouse and do they fit with my own beliefs. And I think the shift is, you know, not so much from an employer, you know, dictating the terms, but you know, I am a person with the right skills, I believe, and where should I lend those skills to, and who should I look at, and what values do their values reflect mine as well?
Absolutely.
So we are now, I had so many more questions for you, and I know there were more hands up, but we are out of time. But I think, you know, this little group here, where you're an MBA group, although we've given up on MBAs, would be doing pretty well, LQ, CQ. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to hand over to Till Leopold, who is going to give a little update on what the Forum's Reskilling Initiative is doing.
Thank you for joining us at this year's annual meeting. So we've talked a lot about skills and the skills landscape, but I think one dimension to add to that is that the investment case for skills is absolutely tremendous. So to just give you one example, from the research that we have done at the World Economic Forum recently, just investment in one skill, collaborative problem solving, could add something like $2.5 trillion to the global economy by 2030. Wow. So you've heard it in the session. We work at the forum with a very broad movement of partners in the Reskilling Revolution initiative to reach at least 1 billion people by 2030. And Jonas mentioned we had just earlier this morning the meeting of the champions that have been with us on this journey since the beginning. And so I'm very happy to update that we are currently on track to reach more than 350 million people on this journey. So some good progress, but of course a lot further still to go. And I just would, of course, invite anybody here in the room or who is listening to our conversation today to reach out to the forum to see how you can be part of this. And other than that, just to thank you all for a very rich and insightful and impactful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.